He doesn't want the hassle. Announced this morning that I was suing Will for $200 million because that video is going to be there forever. It's going to be ubiquitous.
Something is very, very wrong with Jim Carrey. That is not clickbait. That is the raw reaction of millions of people who watched footage from the 51st César Awards in Paris and genuinely could not believe what they were seeing. The man who walked onto that stage to collect his honorary Lifetime Achievement Award did not move like Jim Carrey, did not speak like Jim Carrey. His eyes were different. His jawline was different. His voice was softer, slower, more measured. The volcanic, unpredictable energy that defined one of Hollywood's most distinctive physical performers, the man who gave us The Mask, The Truman Show, and Eternal Sunshine, was simply gone, replaced by something quieter, something that felt, to the people watching, deeply unsettling. And then Katt Williams opened his mouth. And then people started re-watching Dave Chappelle's interviews. And then clone theories stopped being a fringe conversation and became something millions of people were sharing, debating, and genuinely losing sleep over. So here is the question we are going to answer today. Not just, is that really Jim Carrey? But the deeper, darker question underneath it. Why would anyone want to replace him? What did he know? What was he saying? And what is the connection between his apparent transformation, the Epstein files, Katt Williams, Dave Chappelle, and a hidden power structure in Hollywood that at least 3 of the most fearless performers of their generation have spent years trying to expose? Every single piece of this connects. The Paris moment that broke the internet. Let us start with the footage that started everything, because context matters enormously here, and you need to understand exactly what people saw and why it disturbed them so profoundly. The César Awards are France's equivalent of the Oscars. They are a serious, prestigious institution. Being invited to receive an honorary César for a lifetime of work in cinema is not a publicity stunt. It is a genuine recognition from the international film community that your body of work has transcended borders and generations. It is, by any measure, a major honor. Jim Carrey accepted that honor in February at the 51st ceremony. He appeared on the red carpet. He spoke to journalists. He gave a speech that included a section delivered in French. He was charming, gracious, warm, and composed, and nobody could stop talking about how wrong it all felt. Within hours of the footage circulating, social media was not buzzing about the award. It was not discussing the speech. The conversation, on every platform simultaneously, was focused entirely on one thing. This does not look or feel like the Jim Carrey we know. Fans pointed to his eyes first. Jim Carrey has famously dark brown eyes. The man in Paris appeared to have noticeably lighter, greener eyes. Is that lighting? Contacts? Something else? People disagreed, but they could not stop looking. Then the jawline. Softer somehow. The skeletal structure of the face seemed subtly different in ways that people struggled to articulate, but could not dismiss. Then the voice, slower in cadence, lighter in energy, devoid of the volcanic spontaneity that has made Jim Carrey impossible to look away from for 4 decades. And then, most significantly, the energy. That ineffable, impossible to fake quality that makes Jim Carrey. The sense that at any moment, the performance might explode into something genuinely uncontrollable and transcendent. It was simply not there. One person online wrote, "There is no way in hell that was Jim Carrey." Another said, "They're testing us one last time if they can get away with it, like they did with Joe Biden." A third simply posted side-by-side comparisons of old interview footage next to the Paris footage and let the visual discrepancy speak for itself. Now, before we go any further, we want to ask you something directly. Have you watched the Paris footage yourself? Have you compared it to old interviews? Because this is not about being told what to think. This is about using your own eyes and your own instincts. Watch it, then come back to this conversation. Because what Katt Williams and Dave Chappelle have been saying for years, the warnings they issued, the doors they tried to open, they apply directly to what happened in Paris. And the connections are not subtle. What Katt Williams has been telling us. Katt Williams did not come out of nowhere with his Hollywood revelations. He has been building to them for years. And if you have been paying attention, really paying attention, the picture he has been painting is terrifying in its coherence. In his now legendary interviews and stand-up routines, Katt Williams has consistently returned to a specific set of themes: the existence of a controlling entity within the entertainment industry, the pressure placed on performers to conform, to compromise, to accept conditions that ordinary people would never tolerate, the deliberate targeting and silencing of anyone who refuses to play by the unspoken rules, and the specific, documented mechanism by which the industry protects itself from exposure, by destroying the credibility of anyone who speaks out before they can be taken seriously. "I researched my whole life on what the entity was before I got there," Williams has said publicly. "My intention was to get in there and kick up some dust and try to become a whistleblower that they don't knock off, because you know they get all the whistleblowers." Read that statement carefully. He went in knowing the entity existed. He went in with a plan to expose it, and his primary strategic concern was how to become the kind of whistleblower they could not simply eliminate. That is not the language of a comedian doing comedy. That is the language of someone who genuinely believes they are operating in hostile territory and has thought carefully about how to survive it. Williams has spoken repeatedly about the way Hollywood handles performers who become too outspoken, too independent, too difficult to control. The tools available to the industry are not subtle: public reputation destruction, manufactured scandals, legal entanglements, career sabotage, and something far more insidious: the slow, deliberate process of making a person seem unstable, unreliable, and unworthy of being believed, so that when they eventually say something true and important, the audience has already been prepared to dismiss them. Sound familiar? Because that exact playbook appears to have been applied to Jim Carrey, and the timing, the specific moment at which his apparent transformation became undeniable, is the detail that Katt Williams, whether he intended to or not, predicted almost exactly. The Epstein files came out. The documents were unsealed. The network of complicit powerful figures began to be exposed, and Jim Carrey, who had spent years publicly criticizing government corruption, naming secret symbols on national television, warning young people about the dark side of Hollywood, and delivering speeches that felt half comedy and half genuine alarm, suddenly appeared in Paris looking like a completely different person. Is that a coincidence? Katt Williams would tell you there are no coincidences in Hollywood. There are only managed outcomes and controlled narratives. Dave Chappelle's warning and the disappearing act that started everything. To understand why Jim Carrey's apparent transformation resonates so deeply, you need to understand what Dave Chappelle did in 2005. Because what Chappelle did, and more importantly, what he said about why he did it, is the foundational text for everything that follows. At the absolute peak of his commercial power, with Chappelle's show generating $50 million and making him one of the most influential voices in American comedy, Dave Chappelle walked away. He turned down the money. He turned down the fame. He got on a plane to South Africa and disappeared. And when he came back and started talking about what had happened, what he said was extraordinary. He talked about a specific moment on set, a sketch that required him to wear a costume that he felt, in that moment, was not funny, but was instead something darker. They're strong people, and maybe the environment is a little sick. That quote has been shared millions of times in the context of Jim Carrey's Paris appearance, because what Chappelle articulated, with a precision that only someone who has lived it could manage, is the mechanism by which the entertainment industry handles its most powerful and most independent voices. You do not silence them directly. You make them seem unstable. You make them seem changed. You alter the public's perception of them so gradually and so thoroughly that when the person stands before the world and looks and behaves completely differently, the audience's first instinct is to wonder whether the person has lost their mind, not to wonder whether something was done to them. Dave Chappelle walked away before that process could be completed on him. Katt Williams chose to stay and fight it publicly. And Jim Carrey? Jim Carrey apparently did neither. He simply changed. And the change came at the precise moment when the industry had the most to lose from the information he had been trying to share for years. The real Jim Carrey, what he was actually saying. Here is the part of this story that the clone theory debate tends to obscure, Because the focus on whether or not the man in Paris is physically the same person can distract from the far more important question. What was the real Jim Carrey actually saying? What was he trying to communicate? And why would anyone want to silence it? Jim Carrey has one of the most remarkable and genuinely radical public records of any mainstream Hollywood performer in history. Not radical in a safe, career-calculated way. Radical in a way that put real targets on his back from real institutions with real power. He stood at the Golden Globes and delivered a speech that named specific historical analogies between fascist systems of the past and the political reality of America in the present. He called out shamelessness as a character trait of villains, not heroes. He criticized capitalism without a conscience with a fury that went far beyond polite political commentary. He took on the pharmaceutical industry publicly, questioning vaccine schedules on national television in a way that generated massive institutional pushback and mainstream media condemnation. He appeared on network television and, while ostensibly performing comedy, delivered what sounded unmistakably like genuine warnings about the nature of distraction, manufactured entertainment, and the role of media in keeping the public docile and compliant. For years now, he said, in a moment that he framed as comedy but that landed differently, talk show hosts, people on television, people in sitcoms have been hired by the government to throw you off the track, to distract you, to make you laugh and stuff like that, make you happy and docile so you don't know what's really going on. And they get out there in the woods in a circle, and they decide these things. Now, he was laughing when he said it. He was performing. The studio audience was laughing. Jimmy Fallon was playing along. The framing was comedy. But here is a question worth sitting with. When a performer of Jim Carrey's intelligence deliberately wraps a serious message inside a comedic frame, knowing that the comedic frame is the only container in which that message can be delivered without immediate professional destruction, does the comedic frame make the message less true, or does it make it more true? Because only someone who genuinely believes something, and who knows that believing it openly would cost them everything, wraps it in a joke. Katt Williams understood this dynamic perfectly. He has spoken about it directly, the way comedy becomes the vehicle for truth that cannot be spoken straight. The way the laugh track provides cover for the message underneath. The way the audience, conditioned to receive everything from a comedian as entertainment, becomes paradoxically more receptive to the truth being delivered. Jim Carrey was doing this for years. He was the loudest, most visible, most impossible to ignore voice in mainstream Hollywood, delivering messages that the industry's controlling interests had every reason to want suppressed. And then the Epstein files came out. And then he showed up in Paris looking like someone else. Connect those dots yourself. We are simply presenting the timeline, the girlfriend, the grief, and the message that some believe was sent. We have to address this part of the story with care because it involves genuine human tragedy and real suffering. But it is impossible to understand the full arc of Jim Carrey's apparent transformation without addressing what happened in 2015, because for many people tracking his journey, it represents the moment when the warnings stopped being abstract and became personal. In September 2015, Catriona White, Carrey's former girlfriend, was found dead in her Los Angeles home. She was 30 years old. Her death was ruled a suicide. In a note she left behind, she wrote, "Please forgive me. I am just not for this world." The last person she had spoken to was Jim Carrey. She signed her note with a pet name he had given her. The details that emerged in the aftermath were deeply troubling. Toxicology reports revealed multiple prescription drugs in her system, including medication prescribed under a name believed to be an alias used by Carrey. Her family pursued wrongful death litigation. The legal process that followed was agonizing and public and ugly in ways that seemed specifically designed to cause maximum personal damage. Whether or not any conspiracy connects to Catriona White's death is not something we can establish or claim. What we can say is this: Jim Carrey, in the years following her death, became noticeably quieter, less politically outspoken, less willing to use his platform for the kind of targeted, pointed commentary that had made him seem dangerous to powerful institutions. He retired from active filmmaking. He moved away from the mainstream spotlight. He spent years painting, creating vivid, sometimes disturbing visual artwork that seemed to channel the things he could no longer say in public. Many fans and commentators have observed that the trajectory of Jim Carrey's public persona after 2015 follows a pattern that Katt Williams has described explicitly: the gradual, managed silencing of a voice that had become too loud, too specific, and too credible to be dismissed through conventional means. Whether you believe the tragedy was a warning sent deliberately, or simply a devastating personal loss that changed a man profoundly, both possibilities are genuinely heartbreaking. And both lead to the same observation. Jim Carrey became a different person after it. A quieter person, a less dangerous person. A person who, by the time he appeared in Paris in 2026, barely resembled the volcanic, system-challenging force of nature he had been for the previous 3 decades. The cloning theory, what it actually means. Now we need to address the cloning theory directly, because it deserves more serious engagement than it typically receives, not because human cloning of public figures is a documented reality, but because the theory itself is a vehicle for something true and important, and dismissing it entirely means missing the actual message underneath it. When Kid Buu appeared on a podcast claiming to be a clone who had escaped a facility, claiming that memory could be transferred through bone fragments, claiming that the technology had been operational for decades, most people laughed. The claims are extraordinary. The evidence presented is personal testimony from someone whose credibility is, to put it diplomatically, contested. But here is what is actually happening when the clone theory circulates. People are reaching for a framework, any framework, that can explain a phenomenon they observe but cannot account for through conventional understanding. They see a person who looks different, moves differently, sounds different, and has fundamentally altered their public persona in ways that seem inconsistent with organic human change. And because the conventional explanation, people age, people change, celebrities get cosmetic procedures, trauma alters personality, feels insufficient to explain the specific, comprehensive nature of the transformation they are witnessing, they reach for a more extreme framework. The clone theory is the extreme framework, but it is pointing at something real. It is pointing at the documented, historically verifiable fact that powerful institutions do actively manage, reshape, and in some cases fundamentally alter the public personas of individuals who threaten those institutions. They do not need to clone anyone. They have more effective tools available: financial pressure, legal entanglement, reputation destruction, manufactured personal crises, the strategic deployment of grief and trauma, and in the most comprehensive cases, the slow, deliberate construction of an entirely new public identity for a person who has been brought to heel. That is what the clone theory is actually about. Not test tubes and bone fragments, but the documented reality that the person who walks back into the public spotlight after a period of managed pressure is often, functionally, a completely different person from the one who was dangerous enough to require that pressure in the first place. Jim Carrey the clone, if he exists, is simply Jim Carrey, the managed, the controlled, the neutralized, the version of him that is allowed to exist because he no longer says the things that made him a threat. And Katt Williams? Katt Williams has been screaming this exact message for years, in language colorful enough that the mainstream dismisses it, but specific enough that anyone paying attention cannot pretend they didn't hear it. The Epstein connection and the New Mexico investigation. Here is where the individual threads, Jim Carrey's transformation, Katt Williams' warnings, Dave Chappelle's escape, converge with something that is not a theory at all, something that is documented, official, and currently active. The state of New Mexico has officially reopened a criminal inquiry into Zorro Ranch, the sprawling remote property that Jeffrey Epstein owned from the early 1990s until 2023. The New Mexico House of Representatives passed a bipartisan resolution establishing a truth commission to investigate allegations of assault and trafficking that took place at the property. State Representatives Andrea Romero and Mariana Anaya put the measure forward. The Attorney General has announced renewed prosecutorial review. This is not a YouTube theory. This is a state government taking formal, documented, legal action. Zorro Ranch appears multiple times in the released Epstein documents. Survivor testimony, including accounts from Virginia Giuffre, places events at the New Mexico property. Local politicians and officials were reportedly aware of activity at the ranch, And according to the most disturbing allegations currently circulating in connection with the property, allegations that have not been officially confirmed, but that are being taken seriously enough to warrant a formal Truth Commission investigation, the ranch may have been a venue for activities that go far beyond what the public has already processed in connection with Epstein's other properties. Now, what is the connection to Jim Carrey? To Katt Williams? To Dave Chappelle? Here it is. Jim Carrey, in the years before his apparent transformation, was publicly and specifically warning audiences about the existence of a network of powerful people engaged in activities that the public would find incomprehensible if they knew. He was not always explicit. He used the cover of comedy, of philosophy, of artistic expression. But the targets he named, secret societies, government corruption, the use of entertainment as a distraction mechanism, the abuse of power by those who believe themselves untouchable, are the exact same targets that the Epstein investigation is now formally pursuing through the legal system. Katt Williams has stated directly that when he entered Hollywood, he researched the controlling entity thoroughly before arriving. His explicit concern was how to expose it without being knocked off. His observations about the industry's treatment of whistleblowers, the people who speak out and then mysteriously discredit themselves, have personal crises, disappear from public life, or simply change beyond recognition, map precisely onto the documented history of the Epstein network's relationship with the entertainment and media world. And Dave Chappelle? Dave Chappelle walked away from $50 million specifically because he felt the moment he put on a particular costume, he would have crossed a line that the industry wanted him to cross, a line that would have made him complicit in something he did not fully understand, but instinctively recognized as corrupt. He chose poverty over complicity, and the entertainment industry never quite forgave him for it. 3 performers, 3 separate trajectories, 3 separate but deeply consistent accounts of the same underlying reality, and all 3 converging, through timing, through subject matter, through the specific language they use, on the same network that the New Mexico Truth Commission is now formally investigating. The philosophical Jim and what he was actually trying to tell us. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves serious attention, because it is the one most frequently dismissed as irrelevant, and it may be the most important piece of the entire puzzle. Jim Carrey, in the years before his transformation, underwent what can only be described as a profound public spiritual and philosophical evolution. He began speaking extensively about ego dissolution, identity, the constructed nature of the self, the illusion of personality, and the possibility that what we call ourselves is a performance, a character we play, rather than a fixed essential reality. "I don't exist," he said in one widely circulated interview. "They're all characters that I played, including Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey was a less intentional character. I played the guy that was free from concern so that people who watched me would be free from concern." In another interview, on a red carpet of all places, he told a reporter with complete apparent sincerity, "There is no me, there's no you, there's just a field of energy dancing for itself." These statements were widely received as evidence that Jim Carrey had gone through some kind of spiritual awakening, possibly influenced by Eastern philosophy, possibly triggered by grief and personal loss, possibly the result of decades of fame, making the constructed nature of celebrity identity impossible to ignore. And all of that may be true. But there is another way to read those statements, a way that becomes chillingly relevant in the context of everything else we have discussed today. What if Jim Carrey in those interviews was not describing a spiritual insight? What if he was warning us about something specific? What if Jim Carrey as a character was not a philosophical observation about ego, but a literal description of what he believed was being done to him, or what he feared could be done to him? What if he was telling us, in the only language available to him, that the person the public thought they knew as Jim Carrey was already being managed, shaped, and ultimately replaced, and that the replacement would be so thorough that even the person wearing his face would believe they were him? That reading is speculative. We acknowledge that completely. But in the light of what actually happened in Paris, in the light of the man who appeared on that stage and failed to register as the person millions of people had spent decades watching, it is a reading that is very difficult to dismiss. The bigger picture and what it demands of us. Step back now and look at the full shape of what we have covered today. Because the individual pieces are striking, but the shape they form together is what matters. You have Jim Carrey, one of the most outspoken, system-challenging, genuinely dangerous voices in mainstream Hollywood, who appears to have been fundamentally transformed at the precise moment when the network he was warning about became the subject of formal legal investigation. You have Katt Williams, who entered Hollywood with documented research on the controlling entity, with an explicit plan to expose it without being destroyed, and who has spent years delivering increasingly specific and increasingly credible testimony about the mechanisms by which that entity operates. You have Dave Chappelle, who walked away from everything at the moment he was asked to cross a line, who has spoken with devastating clarity about the way the industry pathologizes independence and labels dissent as instability, and who represents the closest thing available to a successful escape from the system both Carrey and Williams spent years fighting from the inside. You have the Epstein files, now formally and legally driving investigations in multiple jurisdictions, including a newly active Truth Commission in New Mexico, confirming that the network of powerful, untouchable figures that all three performers warned about was not a paranoid fantasy, but a documented criminal reality. And you have Paris, a man on a stage, an honorary award, a speech in French, and millions of people watching, unable to shake the feeling that the most impossible-to-replace performer of his generation had been replaced. We are not telling you what to believe. We are genuinely, sincerely not, because this story sits at the intersection of documented fact, credible testimony, and genuine uncertainty. And anyone who tells you they have the definitive answer is either lying or not paying enough attention. What we are telling you is this: the questions are real, the patterns are real, the timing is real, and the people who have been warning about these things, who were laughed at, dismissed, pathologized, and in some cases destroyed for saying them, deserve to be listened to with the seriousness they were denied when it might have made a difference. Katt Williams said, "My intention was to become a whistleblower that they don't knock off." He is still here, still talking, still connecting the dots in public. Whether the industry has decided he is too unpredictable to silence or simply too entertained to stop, that itself is a question worth asking. And Jim Carrey? Somewhere between the wild, volcanic, system-challenging genius who warned us about secret symbols on late-night television and the quietly composed, warmly gracious man who accepted his César in Paris, something happened, something changed. Something that millions of people, watching the footage, could see with their own eyes and feel in their bones, even if they could not name it precisely. The question is not whether you believe in cloning. The question is whether you believe in control, whether you believe that power protects itself, whether you believe that the people who told us this was happening, who tried to warn us, who paid professional and personal prices for trying, were crazy, or whether they were, in the truest and most important sense, the only ones in the room who were sane. That question is yours to answer. If this video made you think differently about what you are watching when you watch Hollywood, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because this story is not over. The New Mexico investigation is live. The Epstein documents are still being processed. And somewhere in the world, a man who either is or is not Jim Carrey is living a life that either is or is not his own. Drop a comment below. Do you think the man in Paris was really Jim Carrey? Do you think Katt Williams and Dave Chappelle have been trying to warn us about something real? And most importantly, now that you know what you know, what are you going to do with it? The conversation starts here.